The sun is a hammer, and the desert is its anvil. A man, an Apache scout named Kale, crouches in the scant shade of a Palo Verde tree, his eyes narrowed against the shimmer of heat rising from the cracked earth. He is supposed to be tracking a small band of renegades for the U.S. Army, a task he performs with the detached efficiency of a man caught between two worlds belonging fully to neither. But the tracks he's been following are not those of warriors. They are the ruts of a single wagon, headed west, deep into territory where no sane settler would travel alone. Now, the tracks are gone, swallowed by a scene of brutal, silent violence. The wagon lies on its side, a great, wounded beast with one wheel splintered and pointing at the merciless sky. Two bodies, a man and a woman, lie near the wreckage, their forms already becoming one with the dust. Kale feels nothing but a tired pang of sorrow. This land does not forgive mistakes. Then he hears it, a thin, wavering cry, nearly lost in the vast, indifferent silence. It's a sound that does not belong here, a sound of pure, desperate life in a place of death. He moves from the shade, his steps soundless, and finds the source. Tucked into a hastily discarded crate, wrapped in a sweat-stained blanket, is a white infant, its face red and screaming at the hostile world. Its parents are gone. Its future is an empty horizon. Kale looks at the child, then at the endless, sun-scorched expanse. Leaving it as a death sentence. Taking it as another kind. For a scout in an army uniform, for an Apache man to be found with a white child in this cauldron of hatred, it is a choice with no good outcome. That was a close call. Before we see how our hero navigates this, tell us in the comments, what's the toughest situation you've ever had to survive? And if you admire pure grit, hit that like button and subscribe. The infant's cries are raw, a primal demand for a comfort that no longer exists. Kale looks from the tiny, clenched fists to the bodies of the man and woman. He sees the telltale signs. Not Apache, not soldier. Bandits, most likely. White men preying on their own. He could ride back to the fort, report the attack, and let them send a patrol. By the time they arrived, there would be nothing left here but silence and bone. He thinks of Captain Thorne, a man whose face was a permanent mask of grim authority, a man who saw the world in columns of black and white, soldier and savage. Thorne would see the dead settlers as a tragedy, and the living infant as a problem to be solved with paperwork and a trip to the nearest orphanage, if it survived that long. He then thinks of his own people, of warriors like Chaco, whose eyes burned with a righteous fire, who saw any Apache in a blue coat as a snake shedding its own skin. To Chaco, this white child would be a symbol of the invaders, the source of their suffering, nothing more. Kale was a man who walked a knife's edge. He'd taken the scout's coat, believing it was a path to understanding, a way to be a bridge. He'd quickly learned that a bridge is something both sides walk over. He was tolerated by the soldiers for his skills and despised by many of his own for his perceived betrayal. He was useful, and therefore, he was alone. Until now. The infant's cries quieted to a hiccuping whimper, its blue eyes, startling in a face smudged with dust, fixated on him. It was a look of pure animal need. There was no judgment in it, no politics, no hatred. It was simply life, asking to continue. In that moment, the choice became terrifyingly simple. It wasn't about the army or his tribe. It was about the creature before him. He knelt, his movements fluid and sure, and gently scooped the bundle from the crate. The child was impossibly light, yet it felt heavier than all the rifles and ammunition he'd ever carried. He lifted the small, wailing bundle, and in that moment Kale, scout for the U.S. Army, became a traitor to everyone but the child in his arms. His first task was survival. The infant's dehydrated cries were a constant, desperate rhythm against his chest. Water. He needed water. His own canteen was nearly empty, enough for him for a day, perhaps, but not for a fragile new life. He scanned the landscape, his gaze sweeping over the jagged mesas and arid plains. He was miles from any known spring, further still from the Verde River. But Kale knew a different map, one not drawn on paper, but etched into memory, a map of secret places taught to him by his grandfather. He recalled Talk of a Seep, a place where water pushed its way through rock after the brief winter rains, a place known only to the old ones. It was a risk. It might be dry, but it was the only risk he had. He gently secured the infant to his chest using the blanket it was wrapped in and a length of leather cord from his saddlebag, fashioning a crude carrier that left his hands free. The baby, exhausted from its crying, had fallen into a fitful sleep, its small head tucked under his chin. He could feel the unnerving warmth of its skin, the faint, fluttery pulse of its breath. It was a terrifying, profound intimacy. He mounted his horse, a tough, steady Mustang that knew the harshness of this land as well as he did, and turned it not east toward Fort McDowell, nor north toward the high country of his people, but southwest toward the jagged teeth of the Superstition Mountains. He was now off the map, a ghost moving between worlds. The sun was a relentless tyrant. It beat down on his hat, on his shoulders, on the small, precious weight against his chest. He kept a piece of the blanket draped over the child's head, creating a small tent of shade, but he could feel the heat radiating from the ground, from the rocks, from the very air they breathed. By late afternoon, the infant began to stir, its whimpers growing into a weak, pathetic cry. A cry of thirst. Cale's own throat was a desert of dust, his tongue thick in his mouth. He stopped the horse and dismounted, using his own body to shield the child from the sun. He uncorked his canteen and wet his finger, touching it to the baby's cracked lips. The infant latched on with a surprising strength, its small mouth working furiously, sucking the few precious drops of moisture. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Panic, an emotion Cale had long ago learned to suppress, pricked at the edges of his calm. He was a tracker, a hunter, a survivor. He knew how to read the land, how to find sustenance where others saw only desolation. But he knew nothing of this. He knew nothing of caring for a creature so utterly dependent, so fragile that a single day of this heat could extinguish its small flame. He looked at the child's face, its brow furrowed in misery, and felt a surge of something fierce and protective. He had made a choice. He would not let it be the wrong one. He pressed on, urging the Mustang into a steady, ground-eating trot. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the western sky, painting the cruel landscape in colors of impossible beauty, he saw it. A subtle shift in the vegetation. A cluster of ironwood trees, their foliage a darker green, huddled against a sheer rock face. It was the sign he'd been hoping for. He dismounted and, with the baby still strapped to his chest, began to climb, his moccasins finding silent purchase on the stone. He followed a nearly invisible trail, a path worn by generations of deer and javelina, and found it tucked into a shallow alcove. A dark stain on the rock, a patch of damp earth, and from a fissure no wider than his thumb, a slow, steady drip, drip, drip of clear, cold water. He fell to his knees, his relief so profound it felt like a physical blow. He cupped his hands, letting the precious liquid gather, and drank deeply. It was the sweetest water he had ever tasted. Then he filled his canteen. The problem of the infant remained. It couldn't drink from his hands. He looked around, his mind racing, and his eyes fell upon his own gear. With his knife, he carefully cut a long, thin strip from the edge of his leather saddlebag. He washed it thoroughly in the dripping water, cleaning it over and over, then soaked it until it was soft and pliable. He dipped the end into his full canteen and gently brought the wet leather to the baby's mouth. At first, the infant turned its head away, confused, but the scent of water was strong. Its mouth opened, and it began to suckle on the leather, drawing the water out in tiny, life-giving drops. Cale sat against the rock wall, the cool stone a comfort to his back, and held the makeshift nipple steady. The child drank and drank, its small body relaxing against his, its whimpers ceasing. In the gathering twilight of the high desert, surrounded by a silence that was now peaceful instead of menacing, Cale fed the child of his enemies, and felt the first, fragile bond between them begin to form. He was no longer just a man with a burden. He was a protector, and in the vast, lonely wilderness of his life. It was the first time in a long time he had felt a purpose that was entirely his own. The next days bled into a routine of harsh survival and quiet intimacy. The seep provided enough water to sustain them, but it was a temporary refuge. They could not stay. Sooner or later, a patrol would come. Either Thorne's men, investigating the wagon, or Chaco's warriors, hunting the ghost they'd heard whispers of, the scout who had vanished. Cale knew he was a dead man to both sides now. The army would see desertion and likely kidnapping. His people would see the ultimate betrayal, an Apache warrior nurturing the seed of their destroyers. His only path was forward into a deeper isolation. He had a destination in mind, a place of last resort, an old Spanish mission, long abandoned by priests but inhabited by a handful of families who had separated themselves from the wars and politics of the territory. It was a place called San Xavier del Sol, the mission of the sun, a week's hard journey to the south. It was a faint hope, but it was all he had. Before they left the sanctuary of the seep, he needed to find more suitable nourishment for the child. Water was life, but it wasn't food. He spent a day scouting the surrounding hills, leaving the infant sleeping safely in the alcove. His grandfather had taught him to see the world not as empty space, but as a larder full of signs. He found the tracks he was looking for, a small herd of wild goats that favored the high, rocky cliffs. Hunting one would be difficult and noisy, but he had another idea. That evening, he tracked the herd to their bedding ground. Moving with a silence that was part of his very being, he crept close, not with a rifle, but with his empty canteen and a small cup. He isolated a nanny with a young kid, waiting with infinite patience until the mother was distracted. In a movement too swift to be seen, he darted in, squeezed a few precious ounces of milk from the startled goat's udder into his cup, and melted back into the shadows before the animal even knew what had happened. He returned to the alcove with his prize. He used the same leather strip, cleaned and soaked in the warm milk. The baby, who he had started to think of simply as anadoi, the Apache word for little one, drank greedily. A real meal. He watched, a strange sense of satisfaction washing over him. Cale, who had been trained to kill, was learning the rhythms of nurturing life. Their journey south was a silent pilgrimage. He walked more than he rode, saving the horse's strength, the steady rhythm of his steps a lullaby for the child on his chest. He talked to her, not in the clipped English he used at the fort, but in the soft, flowing cadences of his own tongue. He told her the names of the plants, the saguaro that stood like ancient, watching giants, the ocotillo that burned with fiery blossoms after rain. He told her the stories of Coyote and the stars, of how the mountains were formed from the bodies of sleeping gods. He knew she didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone, the low, constant rumble of his voice a shield against the vast, empty spaces around them. In these quiet moments, the child became more than a responsibility. He would watch as she slept, her face serene, her tiny hand often finding its way out of the blanket to grip his shirt or his finger. He studied the impossibly fine strands of her hair, pale as corn silk, the delicate curl of her ears. He saw not a white child, not a symbol of an enemy, but simply Anadoi. His Anadoi. This growing affection terrified him. It was a weakness. It was a vulnerability he couldn't afford. It made the thought of giving her up, even at the mission, feel like a betrayal, a tearing of something that had grown inside him. One afternoon, while resting in the shade of a rock outcropping, he saw them, a dust cloud in the distance, moving fast. He pressed himself and the child flat against the rock, his body covering hers completely. He pulled his rifle close, his heart a slow, heavy drum in his chest. It was an army patrol, 6 riders in blue, fanned out, their movements systematic, searching. They were led by a man who sat his horse with ramrod stiffness. Even from a mile away, Cale recognized the posture of Captain Thorne. They weren't looking for a lost child to rescue. They were hunting a deserter. He watched as they passed, their voices carrying faintly on the wind, harsh and guttural. Thorne was pointing, directing the search, his gestures angry and impatient. Kale remained motionless long after they had disappeared over the horizon, his muscles coiled tight. The hunt was on. Thorn would not give up easily. A deserter was an insult to his authority, and an Apache deserter was an affront to his entire worldview. Kale knew the captain would drive his men into the ground to find him. As he held the sleeping child, he realized the mission was no longer a safe option. It would be the first place Thorn would think to look for a man with a baby. He needed a new plan. His mind, a map of the territory, searched desperately for another option, another sanctuary. And then he saw another sign. Not dust, but a glint of light from a high ridge to the east. It wasn't the sun on rock. It was the sun on metal. A rifle barrel. He focused his eyes, his training taking over. A lone rider, sitting perfectly still on his horse, watching. The silhouette was unmistakable. The way he sat his pony, the eagle feather in his hair. It was Chaco. Chaco, the warrior who called him a dog for the whites. He was being tracked from that side, too. A cold dread, colder than any mountain night, settled in Kale's gut. He was caught. Caught between the hammer of the U.S. Army and the anvil of his own people. Both sides saw him as a traitor. Both wanted him, and he stood between them, his only shield the sleeping infant on his chest. The desert was no longer just a harsh environment. It was a closing trap. The knowledge of being hunted by both sides sharpened the world to a razor's edge. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper of pursuit. Kale pushed himself and the horse harder, moving now mostly at night, using the stars as his guide. The days were for hiding, for finding some small crevice or thicket where he could disappear, becoming just another rock, another patch of brush. During these long, silent days, the bond with Onati deepened into a fierce, unspoken covenant. He learned the nuances of her cries, the sharp, demanding wail of hunger, the fretful whimper of discomfort, the soft murmur of contentment as she drifted to sleep against his chest. Her presence was a constant, grounding reality in his spiraling isolation. When the fear threatened to overwhelm him, the fear of Thorn's cold justice or Chaco's hot-blooded vengeance, he would look down at her small, trusting face. He would feel her tiny fingers curl around his, and the world would shrink to that single, vital connection. He was her universe, her warmth, her food, her safety, and she, in her complete helplessness, was his purpose. The reason to draw one more breath, to take one more step. One night, disaster struck. As he navigated a treacherous wash, a maze of sharp rocks and loose scree, his horse, exhausted and spooked by the unfamiliar scent of a mountain lion, lost its footing. The animal went down with a sickening crash, its leg twisting at an unnatural angle. Kale managed to throw himself clear, twisting his body to land on his back and shoulder, absorbing the impact to protect the child strapped to his front. He lay there for a moment, the wind knocked out of him, the baby letting out a startled cry. He scrambled to his feet, his first thought for her. She was shaken but unharmed. His horse was not so lucky. The Mustang's leg was broken, the bone jutting through the skin. There was a terrible finality in the animal's pain-filled eyes. It had carried them faithfully, a silent partner in their desperate flight. Kale felt a pang of grief for the horse and for what its loss meant. They were on foot now. Their chances of reaching any sanctuary had just dwindled to almost nothing. He whispered a quiet Apache prayer for the horse's spirit, then did what he had to do. The single, sharp report of his pistol was unnaturally loud in the silent canyon. It felt like an admission of defeat. It also felt like a beacon, a signal to anyone who might be within earshot. He had to move, and move fast. He salvaged what he could. The water, the remaining strips of dry jerky he carried for himself, the blanket. The weight of his supplies, combined with the child, was immense. The desert, which had been a challenge, now became an adversary of epic proportions. Every mile was paid for in sweat and aching muscles. The soles of his moccasins wore thin on the sharp rock. His body, conditioned to hardship, was pushed to its absolute limit. He began to ration the water with a terrifying strictness, giving the majority of it to the child, his own thirst a raging fire in his throat. During a forced rest in the meager shade of a mesquite bush, the baby began to fret. Her skin was hot to the touch, her breathing shallow. A fever. The dry, relentless heat was finally winning. Cale's careful control shattered, replaced by a raw, primal fear. He had brought her through so much, only to lose her to the sun. He tore a strip from his own shirt, soaked it with the last of the water meant for himself, and gently bathed her face and neck. She quieted slightly, but her skin remained frighteningly hot. Despair was a physical weight, pressing down on him, urging him to simply lie down and let the end come. He had failed. He was a fool who had chosen a path that led only to this, a slow death in the dust for them both. He looked up at the brassy, indifferent sky and felt a rage so profound it shook him. Rage at the bandits who had created this tragedy, rage at Thorn and Chaco for their blind hatred, rage at this land that gave life with one hand and took it with the other. Then he looked down at Anatoly. Her eyes were open, hazy with fever, but they were fixed on him. In that gaze, he saw not an accusation, but a simple, unwavering trust. She didn't know they were doomed. She only knew that he was there. That simple fact was a hook that pulled him back from the abyss. He would not quit. He would not let her last sight be of a man giving up. A memory surfaced, unbidden. A story his grandmother used to tell about a woman of the Cloud people who was lost in the Salt River Valley. She survived by finding the shade of a cave behind a waterfall of stone. A waterfall of stone. Cale scanned the horizon, his mind latching onto the image. He searched for a specific formation, a landmark he had seen once, years ago, on a solo hunt. A series of sheer cliffs that, from a distance, looked like flowing water frozen in time. It was said there was a homestead nestled near there, a place so isolated, so out of the way, that no one ever went there. It was owned by a solitary woman, a widow some called crazy, who had come out west and simply refused to leave. He had guided her party to the spot a decade ago, a young man then, and had been struck by her quiet, unyielding determination. Her name was Martha. It was a mad thought, a straw in a hurricane. She could be long gone. She could be dead. She could turn him away. But it was better than no thought at all. It was a destination, a new hope. He got to his feet, his body screaming in protest. He adjusted the child on his chest, whispering to her in Apache. "Hold on, little one, just a little longer. There's a place. We will find it." With the image of the stone waterfall in his mind, he changed direction, stumbling not south toward the mission, but northwest toward a final, desperate gamble. The world had shrunk to the next step and the one after that. Cale's mind entered a state beyond mere exhaustion, a trance-like state of pure will. The landscape, once full of signs and stories, was now just a series of obstacles to be overcome. A rocky incline to be climbed, a sandy wash to be crossed. The sun was a physical blow with every hour it rose higher in the sky. The fever still held the child in its grip, her whimpers a constant, heartbreaking refrain against his ribs. He gave her the last of the goat's milk he had managed to preserve, and then there was nothing but the carefully rationed water, now tainted with the taste of his own desperation. He knew he was being followed. He didn't need to see them anymore. He could feel it. The prickling on his neck, the sense of being watched. Thorn would be methodical, sweeping the desert in a grid. Chaco would be more intuitive, reading the land, anticipating his moves, smelling his fear on the wind. It was a race, and Cale was losing. His strength was failing. The hope of reaching the widow's homestead was beginning to feel like a fever dream, a story he was telling himself to keep from lying down to die. He stumbled upon a narrow canyon, a deep slash in the earth that offered the only direct path toward the stone waterfall cliffs he sought. It was a shortcut, but it was also a trap. The high walls would offer shade, a brief respite from the sun, but they would also funnel him into a corridor with no escape. He hesitated at the entrance, his survival instincts screaming at him. But one look at Anatoly's pale, listless face made the decision for him. They didn't have time for the long way around. He had to risk it. He plunged into the cool shadows of the canyon. For an hour, there was only the sound of his own ragged breathing and the scuff of his moccasins on the rocky ground. The baby was terrifyingly quiet. He stopped, his heart seizing, and pressed his ear to her chest. He could hear it, a faint, thready heartbeat. She was still with him. He had to keep going. And then he heard it, the unmistakable clatter of shod horses on rock, coming from the direction he was headed, from the mouth of the canyon ahead. He froze, pressing himself back against the canyon wall, his body a shield for the child. Moments later, they appeared. Captain Thorne, at the head of his patrol. His face was dark with dust and fury. He saw Cale, and his expression hardened into one of triumphant contempt. "Scout," Thorne's voice was a harsh crack of a whip. "You have led us on a fine chase. Drop the rifle. Now." Before Cale could react, another sound echoed from behind him, from the entrance of the canyon he had just come through. The unshod hooves of Apache ponies. Chaco and 3 other warriors blocked the path of retreat. Their faces were grim, their eyes burning with a cold fire. Chaco held a war lance, its tip glinting in the sliver of sunlight that reached the canyon floor. Cale was trapped, pinned between the 2 forces that had defined and divided his life. The U.S. Army in front of him, his own people behind him. Both saw him as a traitor. Both saw the child on his chest as something to be taken. Thorne dismounted, his movements stiff and arrogant. "That is Army property you have there, Apache. The child is a citizen. You will hand her over. You are under arrest for desertion and kidnapping." From behind him, Chaco's voice, spoken in their shared tongue, was just as hard. "Cale, you shame your ancestors. You carry the spawn of our enemies while our own children starve. Give us the white child. We will trade it back to them for food, or we will silence its cries for good. It makes no difference, but you will get it to us." Cale stood alone in the center of the canyon, the quiet space between 2 warring worlds. His rifle was still in his hand, but he knew it was useless. To fire on one would be to be killed by the other. He was out of time, out of strength, out of options. He looked down at the child, who stirred weakly at the sound of the angry voices. This was it, the end of the road. But as he looked at her, something shifted inside him. The exhaustion, the fear, it all burned away, replaced by a clarity so pure it was like ice water in his veins. He was not a deserter or a traitor. He was a man who had made a promise to a life that had been placed in his hands, and he would not break it. He slowly, deliberately, leaned his rifle against the canyon wall. He held up his empty hands, a gesture not of surrender, but of peace. He looked first at Captain Thorne, his eyes steady. "This child," he said, his English clear and strong, "is not property. She is not a citizen. She is not a soldier. She is a baby whose parents were murdered, and I would not let her die in the dust." He then turned his head, just slightly, to address Chaco, switching to the Apache language, his voice ringing with a power that silenced the other warriors. "This child is not our enemy. She has shed no blood. She has burned no village. Her heart is pure. To harm her would not make us strong. It would make us as cruel as those we fight. She is not a prize to be traded. She is a life." He turned back to face them both, standing in the middle, a man belonging to neither side, yet speaking a truth that transcended both their hatreds. "You hunt me because I wear this coat," he said to Thorne. "And you hunt me because of the blood in my veins," he said to Chaco. "But you are both the same. You see only what you want to see, a symbol, an enemy. You do not see the person. You do not see this child." He gently adjusted the blanket around Onatari, shielding her face. "Her name is not the white child or the citizen. Her name is Onatari, little one, and she carries no flag. She has no army. I am her army, and I will not give her to you." A tense silence fell over the canyon. Thorne's face was a mask of thunderous rage, his authority challenged by a lone savage. Chaco's expression was unreadable, but one of the warriors behind him shifted, his gaze dropping to the ground. Cale's words had struck a chord deeper than politics, a place of fundamental decency. "You are a fool, then," Thorne snarled, raising his pistol. "A fool who will die for nothing." "He is not a fool. a new voice said. It was a woman's voice, steady and clear, echoing slightly off the canyon walls. And he is not on your land. From a narrow, almost invisible path leading up the side of the canyon, a woman emerged. She was older, her face a roadmap of sun and time, her hair pulled back in a severe gray bun. She carried an old, heavy-looking shotgun, and she held it with an easy familiarity that suggested she knew how to use it. It was Martha, the widow, drawn by the noise. She walked down the scree slope, her boots sure-footed, and came to a stop not behind Cale, but beside him. She looked at Thorn, then at Chaco, her gaze missing nothing. She didn't even glance at Cale, but her presence at his side was a declaration more powerful than any weapon. She looked at the pail, still child on Cale's chest. That baby has a fever, she said, her voice clipped practical. She needs a roof and a proper bed, not a gaggle of armed men arguing over her like a stray calf. She leveled her gaze at Captain Thorn. This is my property line, Captain. You and your men are trespassing. As for you, she said, turning her head toward Chaco, her tone softening almost imperceptibly, there is no honor in threatening a man who is protecting a child. The standoff was broken, shattered by the simple, unassailable moral authority of a woman with a shotgun and common sense. A white woman standing with an Apache man against both the army and the warriors. It was a picture that fit none of their narratives. Thorn looked from Martha to Cale, his jaw working. He had lost control. To open fire now would be to murder a man being defended by a white woman over the life of a white child. It was untenable. He spat on the ground, a gesture of pure disgust. This isn't over, Scout, he seethed, but his threat was hollow. He holstered his pistol and barked an order to his men. They mounted their horses and rode away, their retreat stiff with humiliation. Martha then looked at Chaco. The Apache warrior held her gaze for a long moment. He looked at Cale, at the child, and then at the resolute woman beside them. Something in his expression seemed to break, not defeat, but a flicker of grudging respect, or perhaps shame. Without a word, he lowered his lance, turned his pony, and led his warriors back the way they had come. They were alone, just the three of them, and the sick child, in the sudden, ringing silence of the canyon. Cale felt the strength that had held him upright for days finally begin to desert him. He swayed on his feet, the world tilting. Martha's hand, strong and steady, gripped his arm. "Come on," she said, her voice softened now. "Let's get you both inside." The cabin was small, sparse, but impeccably clean. It smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke. It felt like a sanctuary, a haven at the end of the world. Martha worked with quiet efficiency. She took the baby from Cale's arms, her touch surprisingly gentle. As Cale sank into a chair, his body finally admitting its profound exhaustion, he watched her. She unwrapped Onatari from the soiled blanket, clucking her tongue at the feverish skin. She bathed the child in cool water, dressed her in a small gown made from a soft flour sack, and laid her in a makeshift cradle near the warmth of the hearth. Cale watched it all in a haze, the simple acts of care feeling like a miracle. He had carried her across a desert, fought off 2 armies for her, but here, in this small cabin, was the safety he could never have given her. Martha brought him a bowl of stew and a cup of water. He ate and drank, the food tasting of life itself. He hadn't realized how close to starvation he had come. No words were spoken about what had happened in the canyon. None were needed. The understanding was there in the quiet space between them. Later, as dusk settled, Cale walked over to the cradle. Onatari was sleeping peacefully, her fever broken, her breathing deep and regular. A small patch of color had returned to her cheeks. He reached out a hand, his fingers tracing the air just above her face, hesitant to touch. Then, he gently laid his calloused finger against her soft cheek. She was safe. The journey was over. He was no longer a scout, no longer a warrior caught between 2 fires. His past life, with its divided loyalties and lonely paths, had been burned away in the desert sun. He looked from the sleeping child to the stoic woman tending the fire, and he knew he had not stumbled into a dead end, but to a new beginning. He was a man who had chosen compassion over allegiance, a man who had carried a life across a wasteland and, in doing so, had found his own. In the quiet of the cabin, surrounded by the vast and still indifferent desert, he had finally found a place to stand. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. He made a compassionate choice that changed lives. Do you think more people should act on such instincts? Share your thoughts.